Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall for PC. This is an open-world action role-playing game developed by Bethesda and published in 1996 for MS-DOS exclusively. I say originally because the game was also later re-released as freeware as part of anniversary celebrations for the Elder Scrolls franchise, but that's beside the point. So what about Daggerfall itself? Well, when it first came out, it was generally extremely well received across the board, with a lot of people hailing it as something that was actually revolutionary. It had never really been done before. And Daggerfall would go on to cement the Elder Scrolls as a series that is exemplary of open-world role-playing games, and of course it would also cement Bethesda as a top-tier RPG developer. Of course, that was back in 1996, when Bethesda was pretty much a completely different company to what it is now, so all that praise that would have been heaped on Bethesda back then doesn't really matter anymore. But let's go ahead and start delving into Daggerfall and seeing what we're dealing with here, see if it still holds up to this day, and more importantly, what made it so interesting back in the day. Well, as far as presentation goes, it is miles ahead of what you would see in the Elder Scrolls Arena. If you've seen my video on Elder Scrolls Arena, you know that it really does not look good, even for the day it was released. And Daggerfall doesn't really have that problem. It's pretty contemporary as far as its visuals go, with a 2.5D aesthetic, which holds up remarkably well considering that this game is over 20 years old at this point. Although it stands to reason because it did look considerably better than the Elder Scrolls Arena did, with quite a lot more detail in the sprite work and especially in the environments, and on top of that, it runs a hell of a lot better too. And when you bring all of that together along with the fact that the game runs in a higher resolution than the original Elder Scrolls Arena did, you end up with a recipe for success, at least for the most part. There are quite a few graphics glitches all over the place, particularly clipping through various sprites, as well as certain characters spawning in the middle of walls and things like that, which can get rather annoying. Although unfortunately those are not the worst of the glitches in the game, and it's even worse when an enemy spawns outside of the dungeon, which does happen sometimes, and if it's a plot critical enemy, then, well, you're just screwed. In fact, that brings up one of the biggest problems that this game has, which is its technical side. Now, on a technical level, it is impressive regardless of when you're looking at it. It is an absolutely massive game world that Bethesda claims is roughly the size of Great Britain, but it's a bit smaller than that. Regardless, it is still arguably the biggest video game world ever conceived, with the most ridiculously huge number of locations you can visit and an absolutely absurd number of NPCs. We're talking thousands upon thousands of NPCs. In fact, if I remember correctly, it's well over 700,000. So you're dealing with something with an absolutely insane scale. Problem with that is that the hardware of the time and the coding was not really up to the task, and you end up with a piece of software that is not particularly stable. It is fairly common for the game to crash. It is fairly common for the game to spawn a critical NPC for a quest outside of the boundaries of the map, or to spawn them in a location where you simply can't access them, or to simply not spawn them at all. If you hoard your loot, it is extremely easy to break the game as well, because if there's too much loot in your inventories, whether that be in your various houses, or in your cart, or in your actual personal inventory, well, the memory will actually run out and the game will crash. And unfortunately, that's pretty much the price of a game this large and complex. It's so large and complex that the hardware of the time and the coding that was put into it really was not sufficient for handling every bit of complexity that the game has. Now, of course, the simple reality is that corners had to be cut to make things work, and they also had to be cut to meet deadlines and such, which is why a lot of the game is actually randomly generated. Everything is set in stone, but when they actually made the game to begin with, they randomly generated a lot of the terrain, and as a result, a lot of it is going to feel very samey, and some of it is actually a bit broken. If you go into certain dungeons, then things spawned rather out of kilter, and they didn't go back to fix them necessarily. Now, it's also worth noting that this random generation also causes an issue where if you go into many of the dungeons and many of the towns, you will find that they look very similar, if not the same as other dungeons and towns, and that can lead to a lot of the experience feeling a bit samey. The thing is, with a game on this scale, that's somewhat excusable because you understand they had to cut corners to get to those points. but I can understand where people would be very disappointed in that if they go into it from a more modern perspective, where they're used to considerably smaller open worlds and more handcrafted environments than anything else, although people who are fans of roguelikes will probably be right at home. Now that I've rambled about the visuals and the technical aspects for a while, let me go ahead and talk about the sound as well. Much like in the case of the visuals and the technical side of things, it is considerably better than what we saw in the Elder Scrolls Arena, with the sound not cutting out anywhere near as much as it does in the first game, although you do still have a bit of that here and there when a lot of sounds are trying to play at once. But now it's not a matter of, oh, you can only have one sound playing at any given time. Now you can have the music and several of the sound effects running at the same time, and they don't glitch out as much. Not to mention, they're just simply better quality sound effects, and the music is a bit more interesting and moody as well. There's also some very limited voice acting which comes up during major cutscenes, but other than that, when you're talking to NPCs or just going around and even talking to major NPCs, they don't have voice dialogue and instead it's all text. But that was normal for the era, so there's nothing really to complain about there unless you're coming from a modern perspective and you're used to every line in every video game being voiced. To which I say, you whippersnappers and your voice dialogues and your laziness! In my day we had to read entire novels worth of text from these NPCs! But regardless of the state of the voice acting, the sound design in general is definitely an improvement over the Elder Scrolls Arena, and it does hold up reasonably well to this day, which means that for the most part, the presentation does hold up rather well. It's just in the technical side of things where it gets really messy, and that's something that never really goes away no matter what aspect of the game you're looking at. Whether you're looking at it from just a visuals and sound design perspective, or even from a story and gameplay perspective. Which of course leads me into what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. The story in this is that you play as an agent of the Empire who is sent to the kingdom of Daggerfall to do two things. First, investigate how a particular letter that was sent by the Emperor to the Queen of Daggerfall hasn't arrived. And second, you're investigating the death of King Lysandus of Daggerfall and trying to find a way to free his ghost, which is currently haunting the streets of Daggerfall. After you start your investigation, it pretty quickly becomes clear that there's a lot more going on in the provinces of Hammerfell and High Rock than you previously thought, and you very quickly become part of the various political machinations that the various factions are engaging in to get control of the Iliac Bay. To that end, there are 6 major factions you're going to be dealing with throughout the course of the main story, and those are 3 kingdoms, which are Daggerfall, Wayrest, and Sentinel, as well as the Underking, who is this undead creature, as well as the King of Worms, Mannimarco, and the Orcs of Orsinium. Now, those aren't the only political factions in the Iliac Bay, but those are all the major ones that you'll be dealing with throughout the course of the main story, and depending on your various reputation levels between those factions and who you ultimately decide to join, you're actually going to have different endings for the storyline. In fact, there's 6 different endings depending on your choices. This is basically like night and day compared to the Elder Scrolls Arena, which of course only had one ending, but it also barely even had much of a storyline to begin with, and that was really just find the MacGuffins and then defeat the evil wizard. Meanwhile, you go over to Daggerfall and you're dealing with political machinations between lots of different factions in High Rock and Hammerfell, as well as tortured spirits that you need to find some way to actually free, as well as things like ancient lore, as well as these various curses that just kind of perpetuate, and even the nature of divinity in the realm of Tamriel. Daggerfall takes the pretty bare-bones framework that Arena established for the world of Tamriel and expands upon it greatly. Now, of course, this does manifest in the various books that you can find throughout the game that you can read, but it also manifests even in the main story when they explain the various elements of lore to you, so you have a better understanding of what's going on and why things are important. This ultimately means that even though it is very similar to Arena in terms of its overall gameplay style, it feels considerably more complex and a lot more like a proper role-playing game as opposed to simply a dungeon crawler like Arena was. This in turn makes the main storyline a lot more interesting and more involved than what you were doing in the Elder Scrolls Arena, and really you can consider Daggerfall the real start of the Elder Scrolls series as far as we know it today. Basically everything you know about the Elder Scrolls really does stem from Daggerfall more than it does from Arena, because even though Arena did put in some of the initial groundwork, it was really Daggerfall that brought the universe of the Elder Scrolls to life. And it was Daggerfall that also created the gameplay style that we recognize from the Elder Scrolls today. The basic stat system carries over from Arena, as does the very basics of the class system, but this is the game that introduced custom classes and really did let you customize your character to your heart's content. In fact, the class customization system in Daggerfall is the most complex it's ever been in the Elder Scrolls series, giving you quite a lot of skills to choose from, and even various advantages and disadvantages. And of course, if you're that guy who shows up to the tabletop session and has the stupidly overpowered character that you've min-maxed to all hell, you can certainly do that in Daggerfall as well with that advantage and disadvantage system, because the entire system is based on point buy. So you put the points into your various stats and your skills, as well as your various advantages and disadvantages, in order to get something that you really feel comfortable with. Once you've created your character, you venture out into the world of Daggerfall, and you find that you start the game in a dungeon, and once you've gone through that dungeon and managed to get out of it, then you are free to explore the world of Daggerfall to your heart's content, and you will find that it is a massive world indeed. Bethesda claims it is roughly the size of Great Britain in terms of actual in-game landmass, but it's actually a bit smaller than that, even though you are dealing with thousands upon thousands of NPCs and thousands of locations to explore as well. A lot of it was randomly generated, and there is a fair deal of random generation as far as which NPCs you will encounter and what they can say, as well as what quests get generated in terms of just the general quests, but most of the particulars are going to stay the same no matter what. It's certainly not a roguelike where the entire game is randomly generated when you start it. It was randomly generated during the development phase of the game, and then they set it all in stone before they shipped it out. And the random quests that you get are generally things like go to this dungeon and take out this particular monster, or deliver this item to some other location, or things like that. Stuff that you would generally consider to be a fairly randomly generated quest anyway. So that's never really that much of a problem unless you do decide to go on a lot of those randomly generated side quests and things just start to feel very samey. And speaking of being the same, one thing I forgot to mention earlier with regards to the skill system is that if you've played one of the more recent Elder Scrolls games, you're going to notice it functions pretty much the same as the newer games, in that as you use your various skills, they level up over time. This wasn't the case in Arena because Arena didn't have skills at all, it only had stats, and then you just had whatever your equipment was. In Daggerfall, there's certain equipment that you can't use if your class prohibits it, and if you use equipment that you're not skilled in, then it's not going to be very effective either. In fact, if you played one of the more recent Elder Scrolls games before this at all, you're going to find a lot of it is very familiar, not just the skill system. This was the Elder Scrolls game that introduced the guilds in the way we know them today. While some of them had their start in the Elder Scrolls Arena, they were really more set dressing than anything else. In this one, you can actually join the factions, and you have actual faction progression, in that you gain reputation as you complete various quests, and as you advance in rank in that particular guild, you gain access to better services and that sort of thing. Of course, the mainstays of the Elder Scrolls series are all here. You can, of course, join the Fighters Guild, Mages Guild, and Thieves Guild, but you can also even join the Dark Brotherhood, and there are various knightly orders and temples that you can join, but you can only join one of each of those. This was also the Elder Scrolls game that introduced the ability to be infected with lycanthropy and vampirism, although lycanthropy is different from the way you would see it in later Elder Scrolls games, where you could only become a werewolf. In this one, you can become a werewolf or a wereboar. And unlike in, say, Skyrim, where that's just an empowerment fantasy, here it's actually a very real condition that you do need to be aware of, and you need to be very careful if you do decide to become a vampire or a werewolf or wereboar. This is also what introduced the idea of spell schools to the Elder Scrolls series. In the previous game, it was just a bunch of spells that you had, and you could of course create your own spells. Here you can still create your own spells, but they are governed by the various schools of magic, for example, destruction, alteration, restoration, and so on. And of course, like in later Elder Scrolls games, they're classified as skills, so you set them up in your class, or you pick a class that has whatever that skill is, and as you use those spells, your skill in that particular school of magic is going to increase. And speaking of magic, of course, you can enchant equipment, and you can go on various Daedric quests in order to acquire particularly powerful artifacts, such as Oriel's bow or the Flabberjack or Chrysamere, which would later appear in other Elder Scrolls games. Of course, artifacts did exist in the Elder Scrolls arena, but here they were greatly expanded upon and made an kind of integral part of the Elder Scrolls lore. So the vast majority of what you see in this game is going to be very familiar to you if you've played one of the later games in the Elder Scrolls series, particularly if you've played Morrowind, but even if you've played Oblivion or even Skyrim, a lot of it is still going to be very familiar. One thing that's going to be slightly less familiar is the way that they handle transport in this particular game. Now, you can of course just walk everywhere you want to go, but that takes quite a while, so more likely than not you're going to want to buy a horse. And if you buy a horse, then you may as well go ahead and buy a cart along with it so you can have extra storage space when you go on your various dungeon crawls, because you're going to be coming across quite a lot of loot and you can only carry so much. Whenever you're in a dungeon, you can go back to the entrance and click on the doorway to the entrance, and it will ask you if you want to access your wagon, in which case you can drop off whatever loot you were carrying and go back to exploring the dungeon to your heart's content. Now that said, you can only do that at the entrance to the dungeon, which means if you go delving rather deep into the dungeon and you end up getting maxed out on your inventory space, then it could be quite a long trudge back up to the entrance, because this brings up one of the biggest problems that Daggerfall has. Whenever you're going on those various dungeon crawls, those dungeons are labyrinthine to a fault. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if the map system were up to the task, but they decided that they were going to go with a 3D map for this one, as opposed to the 2D map you saw in the Elder Scrolls Arena, where you could actually make notes on it. And the 3D map in Daggerfall is just garbage. It does not work very well, and it is very difficult to actually see where you are in relation to particularly other floors of the dungeon, but even in your own floor, a lot of it will just be spliced up, because there's various staircases or various ramps that lead to and from other floors that make it difficult to navigate. And issues like that even extend into the overworld map where you're going to fast travel. Now, you access it in the same way you accessed it in the Elder Scrolls Arena, by right-clicking on the map icon as opposed to left-clicking on it. But when you are presented with the map of Daggerfall, or at least the region of High Rock and Hammerfell that the game takes place in, you find out very quickly that it's very overwhelming. There are a lot of locations, and by a lot of locations I mean thousands of them, to the point where you can't individually click on most of them because they're so small. Thankfully, Bethesda understood this, and they included a find feature where you click on that and then it brings up a text box to type in the location that you're searching for, and if you type that in, then it will instantly pinpoint wherever that is, at least as long as it's in that same region. Of course, this is where those of you who have played Morrowind or Oblivion or Skyrim will notice that the fast travel in this doesn't work necessarily the same as it does in later games in the series. It takes a matter of days, because a lot of cases you'll be traveling from one end of the Iliac Bay to the other, and that can take upwards of several months, even by ship, because you can select the method of travel by foot or horse or ship, and you can also select the manner in which you're going there, whether it be cautiously or recklessly, and whether you're camping out in the wilderness or you're stopping at inns along the way. It'll give you your cost in terms of actual gold pieces, but it'll also give you your cost in time, and that's something you need to worry about, because the vast majority of quests in this game are timed. And more often than not, they'll give you just barely enough time to get from wherever you are to wherever the quest is taking place, and get back in order to receive your reward. Otherwise, if you manage to fail that quest based on the time, then, well, you don't get any rewards for it. This is an issue that you can't really get over, because it really does highlight one of the biggest problems that Daggerfall has, aside from, of course, its dungeon issue, which is that the world is just too big. Sure, there's plenty to do in the game, but you're only really going to be exploring locations if you just feel like it, or if it's on a particular quest that you're going on. So it kind of becomes a waste more than anything else. And then of course there's the issue of the sheer scope of the game causing problems as far as its programming goes. I've already mentioned numerous technical problems that the game never really recovers from and that never really got patched out of it, and even with patches, this game is still buggy as hell, so that's something to keep in mind if you decide to go into this. And then of course, it being an early to mid-90s RPG, it's pretty unforgiving as far as its difficulty goes. I mean, you'll wander into a dungeon and you'll be level 1, and you'll be fighting things like harpies harpies, which you can't even damage because you don't have at least a dwarven weapon or better. That's of course not to say that the game is so difficult it becomes unplayable or anything, but it can be very frustrating when you're starting out and getting used to how the game plays. Once you're used to it, you pretty much expect that sort of thing, and it's not really that big of a deal. But there is that adjustment period that a lot of people simply aren't going to be able to overcome. You gotta keep in mind that this game was really not designed with the same mentality that later games in the Elder Scrolls series would be developed with. Todd Howard's development style is a lot more of an empowerment fantasy than anything else. It's more of a theme park for the player to wander around in. With the first two Elder Scrolls games, they were designed to be more virtual dungeon masters. They gave you a scenario and let you just wander around and play to your heart's content, and they were really designed more for people who were already fans of role-playing games, particularly tabletop games to begin with, as opposed to later games in the series where they would try to expand their audience a lot more, and then once you finally hit Skyrim, you have reached the point where Bethesda pretty much assumes that the player is going to be a complete idiot who can't think for themselves. That's simply not the case with Daggerfall. There's numerous elements in the game that are simply not explained to the player unless you go out of your way to try to find them in the game. It really is a proper old-school role-playing game that has a bit more emphasis on dungeon crawling than it really should, but generally speaking is arguably the best game in the Elder Scrolls series. Does that mean it's perfect? Hell no. It is extremely buggy, it is very difficult to get into if you're not already a fan of role-playing games, and if you've played later games in the Elder Scrolls series, you're going to find the adjustment period is very, very steep. But if you do manage to get past all of that, you'll find a rather rich role-playing game from an era where you really wouldn't expect them to be all that rich outside of maybe Ultima. And when you compare it to Arena, you wonder how they could even possibly be from the same series. I mean, Daggerfall runs a hell of a lot better, it plays a lot better, it has vastly improved controls, including a mode where you can wander around with the arrow keys and look with the mouse, which at that time was a very new thing. And of course, it is just leaps and bounds ahead of it in terms of complexity and lore, and just generally being interesting as a video game. This is why I say that Daggerfall is really the true start of the Elder Scrolls series. Sure, the groundwork was laid in Arena, but it was Daggerfall that set everything in stone, and even with its myriad problems, it is still well worth playing to this day. Just know what you're getting into if you do decide to play it. It is not for the faint of heart, but if you do manage to overcome its problems, you will find one hell of a role-playing game in there. If you're interested in picking up Daggerfall for yourself, I will have a link in the video description box where you can get that from Bethesda, but you will have to have a setup guide for that because it's not actually an installer, it's just the game files themselves that you'll need to install via DOSBox. An alternative method is that if you buy one of the other Elder Scrolls games on GOG, then you actually get both Arena and Daggerfall included for free, and those come with their own installers, so you may want to go ahead and do that if there's another game in the Elder Scrolls series that you're looking to pick up. Thanks for watching.